Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, host of the Football History Dude podcast, right here on the Sports History Network. Now, before we jump into another sports history adventure, let me tell you about this episode's sponsor. We partnered with Rochester Sports Autographs, the largest JSA authenticated autograph distributor in the United States, where you can get deals on over 30,000 autographed sports collectibles. They even have film, music, and other entertainment autographs on the site, so there's something for everyone. Perhaps you're looking for a gift for Mother's Day, or maybe Father's Day. Heck, who needs a holiday as an excuse to give a piece of sports history to your loved ones? Or how about yourself? Today seems like a great day to add to your sports cave, right? But how is RSA able to offer such great deals on JSA authentication, you ask? Well, they do this by making deals directly with athletes, so there are no extra markups, and they choose to pass these savings on to the customer. All orders from Rochester Sports Autographs are top quality and shipped to your door with top authentication and money-back guarantee. And to make sure RSA knows that the Sports History Network sent you, we created a special link for you. All you have to do is head to shoprsa.com/SHN. Again, that's shoprsa.com/SHN. Head over there to get your piece of sports history today. This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to yet another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. We are your hosts, Andrew and Dan Newman. I am Dan Newman. I am joined as always by Andrew Newman. And Andrew, how are you doing on this fine evening?
I am doing okay, Dan. We got our most significant winter storm yesterday here in the Hudson Valley of New York. Really the first significant storm of the year. But, just when you think, we might get off light. Nope, big storm yesterday as we're here in mid-March as we're recording this. So the positive, though, was that I didn't go to work and used that time to finish studying for today's podcast episode.
And we are recording this on Wednesday, the 15th of March. It's too bad that your snowstorm didn't come tomorrow, so you could watch NCAA basketball all day.
That is a very good point.
I am lucky enough to be on paternity leave at the moment, so I will be spending all day tomorrow, obviously caring for the child, but then also watching as much NCAA basketball as I can. And then Friday, I am actually headed North Carolina to attend the NCAA tournament. I've only been to the tournament once before, and as I may have mentioned on the podcast in the past, it was about 5 years ago, and I was actually at the UMBC Virginia 16-1 upset. So not expecting anything quite so epic this time around, but very much looking forward to another trip to the NCAA tournament, which is a lot of fun. Highly recommended for anybody who ever has the chance to do it. We've got kind of an interesting topic tonight, but before we get into that, I just want to first of all give my normal announcement to please follow us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. You can check us out on Facebook at Hello Old Sports Podcast. I checked it out the other day, and we have something like over 300 followers, which is great and really appreciated. And then obviously rate us, review us, all that good stuff. You can contact the show, hellooldsports@gmail.com. I also wanted to note, there's only a few days left. Voting closes in early April. We are nominated under the Best Sports Talk Podcast Award for the Sports Podcast Group. You can vote for us at sportspodcastgroup.com and then click on the awards tab, and that's sportspodcastgroup.com. It is spelled just like it sounds. We're up against some interesting, some relatively well-known names. I saw JJ Redick's podcast is nominated in our category, and a couple of other names that are relatively well-known. So, as they say, it's an honor just to be nominated, but we would love it if you all would just take a minute and go ahead and vote for us.
Yeah, it was kind of a welcome surprise to hear about that, because I didn't know we were even, I didn't know how we would have ended up on on anybody's radar for that. So thank you to Arnie Chapman, who's the head of the Sports History Network, for spreading the word on some of the podcasts that we have here. You're right. You look at some of the people on the list that are sort of famous names, and hopefully the criteria that they're using to determine who wins this isn't total downloads or annual salary or anything like that. But I'm under no illusion we're going to win this, but it is just kind of cool to see our sort of thing there alongside, because you would have to assume that means at some level somebody who's deciding these things listened to at least some of our podcast and decided they like what they heard. So whether it was a 5-minute clip or whatever, they had to have at least said, oh, they're able to string together complete sentences, so let's put them on there.
The clip that was put on the website, just as sort of a sample of what we do, and I assume this is what Arnie submitted for us, but if you click on our podcast on the website, you can check out, every podcast has like a 5-minute sample of that podcast, and ours is an interesting one. It actually goes back to one of our earlier episodes, and it is when we had my friend Abe on to talk about the New Jersey Nets of the 90s and early 2000s, and we were talking about the Nets changing their name to the New Jersey Swamp Dragons and sort of analyzing how and why that failed. So of all the things to have as a part of our our application packet, if you will, I thought that was pretty neat, because it kind of speaks to some of the more obscure conversations we had. And we are nominated, among others, the other nominees in our category: Kenny Mayne, Colin Cowherd. I mentioned JJ Redick as the Lead, which I believe is a podcast from The Athletic that talks about the sort of the top stories in sports that day. And I was a listener to that for a while myself. So it's a good category. Glad to be nominated in it, and some of our other fellow podcast Sports History Network shows are nominated in some other categories. So check them out too. All right, well, on to today's topic, and we are always sort of looking for new and novel things to delve into here on the Sports History Network. And, Andrew will have an idea, or I'll have an idea, and we'll run it by the other. And, I can't think of one that the other person has ever rejected. So, Andrew, this was kind of your idea, and you're thinking maybe this might be a little bit of sort of the first in a periodic series. So why don't you go ahead and tell us both about the concept and about who we're going to talk about tonight.
Sure. And while we're at it, I have another series idea that would be a little off the beaten path, but it's kind of the flip side of what I'm going to mention in a second. And we could call it, we could worry about the title later, but something along the lines of Done to Death. And this is where we talk about ones that have been done to death, but we limit ourselves to either 10 or 15 minutes. So if we want to talk about stories that have been there's been a million things about, the Lakers Celtics 80s rivalry, or, the Red Sox curse, or whatever, probably a theme that the first two things I came up with were Boston things, but you know what I mean? Where we can go, all right, we're going to do this as a standalone thing, and we are going to set a timer. But anyway,
I don't think we're going to set a timer and be able to stick to it. So
the idea I came for this, and this is going to be called the Wilderness Years. And where this actually, the germ of this idea for me was actually when we were at Lambeau Field back in the fall. Me and you and our father went to Green Bay. We saw a Packers game, and the next day we went back and we went to the Hall of Fame, and we saw, the Packers Hall of Fame is great. And what I'm about to say is not a slight to them at all, but there's a lot in the early days, sort of where did the Packers name come from, and Curly Lambeau, and then, the pre-war teams. And then we, cover the Vince Lombardi era. And then there's basically one wall that says the Wilderness Years, and it's 1968 to, 1991 or 1992. And then we're into the Brett Favre era. And my thought was, I understand why they need to do that. I understand why in a franchise that's had a proud history, they have to skip basically 25 years of bad football. But I bet within that 25 years, there's some really interesting stories. the first one, and with the Packers, who I imagine we'll get to eventually, it's a little less interesting because the decline started because Vince Lombardi left. But I was thinking of sort of some of these proud franchises that are just consistently good. And sort of their dark periods. You know, the Yankees of the late 60s and early 70s comes to mind. The Lakers, I guess, in the early to mid 90s, the Nick Van Exel teams come to mind. We will have a few of these, and there's not a million you can do, but that's sort of my idea. And where we landed on to start is the 1980s Pittsburgh Steelers. So this is really going to be the era between the end of their 4 championship. You know, they win the Super Bowl in 74, 75, 78, 79. And then in 1992, Bill Cowher is hired. And what happened in that intermediate time? You know, a short answer is going to be a lot of their guys got old and they retired.
Yeah.
But that wasn't in one fell swoop. They didn't suddenly go from a great team in 1979 to has-beens in 1980. There's a lot of interesting stories in there. And there's also some stuff that just, I haven't been to the Steelers Hall of Fame, but I have a feeling certain things would just be a small square on a wall between winning the Super Bowl in 1979 and Bill Cowher gets hired in 1992. And we're going to cover some of that tonight.
Yeah.
Did I do a good job explaining it?
You did an excellent job explaining it. So you sort of set the table a little bit in that the Steelers won the Super Bowl. They won Super Bowl 14 in 1979 with a core of players that had basically been there. They won 4 in 6 years. So that was less time than the 49ers. The 49ers won 4 in 9 years. The Green Bay Packers won 5 NFL titles in 7 years. So that's a somewhat comparable period of time. But as far as the Super Bowl era, much shorter time period for the Steelers, which means a lot of the core was there for all 4 championships.
And we'll list some of these guys as they retire. Some of the guys, you get to the mid to late 80s, and there's a handful of guys that are still on the team, and it's almost unbelievable. But sort of before we jump in to after that era, it's kind of important with the Steelers, and I think this gets lost, to talk about, you know, when they talk about the Lombardi Packers, they talk about how they were a once proud franchise that had fallen on hard times in the 50s, and he took over this sort of collection of misfits. But, you know, they obviously had these glory days in the 30s and early 40s and, you know, even the 20s. From when the Steelers came into the league in 1933 all the way through until 1972, they had made a playoff once. They had never made an NFL championship game. They had certainly never won an NFL championship. Their only postseason appearance was in 1947 when they played in a tiebreaker, because this was still the era of East Division champion, West Division champion NFL championship game. They played the Eagles in a tiebreaker and lost at Forbes Field on December 21st, 1947 by a score of 21-0. And that was the postseason experience of the Pittsburgh Steelers for the first basically 40 years of their existence.
So they had 0 postseason points in basically 4 decades.
Yes. You know, they had the year where they were combined with the Eagles, and then the year where they were combined with the Cardinals, but they were not a proud franchise by any stretch of the imagination. They were almost what the Arizona Cardinals have been the last 40 years.
And it was difficult for the owner, Art Rooney, because he was one of the sort of original, not a founder, but you have these big owners that are a part of the NFL and sort of ushering it through the 30s, 40s, 50s. And that's George Halas with the Bears. That's Tim Mara with the Giants. That's George Marshall with the Redskins. and that's Rooney with the Steelers. And the other three all had significant periods of winning, significant championships in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Steelers under Art Rooney had absolutely none of that. So, they talk about how he was just a perennial loser for 40 years.
So what I'm going to do here, because I want to purposely skip over as much of the 70s Steelers as we can, because that's not the focus of the episode. And you basically either have to do a lot or do a little. So I'm going to essentially do this from when Chuck Noll gets hired, and we'll talk more about Chuck Noll as this goes on, but I'm going to use him as the bookend. So in 1968, the year before Noll takes over, the Steelers go 2-11-1. As I mentioned, they hadn't played in a playoff game in 21 years, hadn't played in a championship game ever. 1969, they hire Chuck Noll after, do you know who the original person they tried to get to take the job was?
Was it Lombardi?
No.
Was it Matt?
Think that part of the country.
Wasn't Bud Grant? Was it Bud Grant?
No, you're not the NFL.
Not the NFL. Paul Brown.
Joe Paterno.
Oh, and it's funny too, because when we talked about the Giants, something with the Giants a while back, we talked about how Paterno was about to get that job in the late 70s.
So real quick, Paterno took over as the head coach of Penn State in 1966. He was offered the head coaching job of the Steelers. He was offered $70,000 a season. Reportedly, he was making $20,000 at Penn State. He was close to accepting, but he started thinking about basically what he said, in this interview years later, was he thought he would be kind of screwing Penn State by leaving so quickly, and that he would have really put them in the hole. So he decided to stay. So the Steelers go to Chuck Noll, who takes over in 1969. Like I said, we'll get a little more into Chuck Noll. He'd been a player with the Cleveland Browns. He was a Cleveland kid. Started to play at Notre Dame, I'd agreed to play at Notre Dame, but then had a seizure during practice before he could ever play. And the coach at the time didn't want anything to do with him and taking that kind of risks. He then went, and after college, he went and became an assistant coach in the AFL with the LA Chargers. And do you know who one of his defensive charges was on those Charger teams?
This is sometime in the mid 60s?
Early 60s.
Jeez, I'm doing bad with the guessing tonight. Early 60s, one of his best.
The big cat, Ernie Ladd.
Oh, he would go at him tooth and nail.
And I have a quote here from Ernie Ladd on Chuck Noll, where he basically says, like, Chuck Noll was the best teacher coach that I ever had. He would really hammer you about the fundamentals, and sometimes he'd really get on your nerves, but he was still he was a great sort of teacher of the game. So he went from there to, and I guess I am just going to get into his biography here. He went from there to the Colts, where he was the defensive coordinator for the 1968 Baltimore Colts under Don Shula. And that was the, team that went 13-1, went to the Super Bowl, lost to the Jets. And from there, he takes the job with the Steelers. Takes over in 1969. They go 1-13, obviously the worst record they've ever had as a franchise, really the bottoming out of it. And then you just start to see steady progress. 1970, 5-9, 71, 6-8. 72, they go 11-3. They get to the AFC title game and they lose to the undefeated Dolphins. 73, they're 10-4. They lose in the divisional round. And then 74, 10-3-1. They win the Super Bowl. 75, 12-2. They win the Super Bowl. 76, 10-4. They lose in the AFC title game, which would have been to the Raiders. 77, they go 9-5. They lose in the divisional round. 78, 14-2. They win the Super Bowl. And then in 79, they go 12-4 and they win the Super Bowl with over the Rams in that game. And I guess technically January of 1980, but the end of the 70s.
And much like the Packers of the 60s and the 49ers of the 80s, they are able to truly do all of their winning in a single decade. So the Packers truly are the team of the 60s, the 49ers truly are the team of the 80s, and the Steelers truly are the team of the 70s, because once the 70s are over, the winning stops for the Steelers immediately.
So in 1980, and we'll go year by year, but not necessarily game by game, and we'll talk about, we'll obviously spend more time on interesting stuff. So 1980, they fall to 9-7. They miss the playoffs. John Stallworth is hurt for almost all of the year in 1980. To compare sort of the drop off, in 1979, they had the first ranked offense in the league. In 1980, it was 10th. In 1979, they had the fifth ranked defense in the league. In 1980, it was 15th.
And with the exception of Stallworth being hurt, it's pretty much the same team.
Yeah, and that's the thing is there's a couple of guys who retire at the end of the 80s season, which I'll touch on in a second. Nobody has really left yet. Certainly there was no reason to think going into 1980 that the season was, that the Steelers were done. You know what I mean? So here's the quote I wanted to find. This is from the Washington Post from August 4th of 81. So after the 80 season, but before the 81 season, basically it's by an article by a guy named Gary Pomerantz. And he said, now the voice has drifted through the Alleghenies and settled here as though it has squatters' rights. It is the same voice that long ago abused Green Bay, Miami, and others. After it leaves here, it will wait, then find a new neighbor to deceive. It is a voice that says the dynasty is over. And then I'll skip the next paragraph. It's fine, but I don't want to read the whole article. And then it says, and this is especially brutal here. Last year, the Pittsburgh Steelers were 9-7 and did not make the playoffs for the first time in 9 years. When the postseason came, in came Cleveland, Dallas, and Philadelphia. The Steelers went with the New York Giants, New Orleans, and the rest of them. The team that had won the Super Bowl for the previous 6 years didn't even qualify for the finals. So basically, and I mean, by 1980, you would throw the Giants in there with the Saints, but basically saying like, oh, the Pittsburgh Steelers didn't make the playoffs. They went, and this is kind of what we've seen with the Patriots the last couple of years, where it's like, oh, the Patriots are like out of it in December. And that was the Steelers team did not qualify for the postseason. And they still had a winning record, but it was certainly a big thing to not make the playoffs for the first time since 1972.
And
as the defending champion.
I would note that Gary Pomerantz has written quite a book about the Steelers, and the book that I used quite a bit about the Steelers. And the book that I used for a lot of my prep is called Their Life's Work, The Brotherhood of the 1970s Pittsburgh Steelers, Then and Now. I think it was written about 10, 12 years ago. And it's written by Gary Pomerantz. So he's got a long track record of writing really good stuff about those 70s Steelers teams and their aftermath.
Yeah. So I have a little quick article on the 1980 team. They had a chance obviously through the end of the season. And then I believe they lost three of their last four to miss the playoffs. By the time they played their last game of the season, they had been eliminated. At the end of the season, you get your first sort of slate of retirements: Rocky Bleier, Mike Wagner, Dwight White. So again, not Rocky Bleier had obviously been a key player on the team, but you still had the core of the team. Mostly the defensive core of the team was still intact.
All those guys that end up in the Hall of Fame eventually: Lambert, Ham, Blunt, Joe Green. All those guys are still around.
Yeah, and on the offensive side of the field too. Mm-hmm. Did you have anything to say on 80 before we went forward a little bit?
No, because I think they actually kind of rebound in 81, and their motto is one for the thumb in 81. And I think they make it back to the playoffs in 81, don't they?
No.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
So in 81, they finish, let me get this pulled up here. In 81, they finish 8-8 by what I have here. Yeah, they're still 8-8 in 1981. This is actually Tony Dungy's first year on the staff for the Steelers. They had been 8-5, and they lose their last three games to fall to 8-8 and miss out on the playoffs. Their last 3 losses, they lose to Oakland, Cincinnati, and Houston. They're all fairly close games, a 3-point game, a 7-point game, and a 1-point game. This is also a year where Terry Bradshaw starts 14 games, but Mark Malone makes starts for the Steelers for the first time in 1981. And Mark Malone, for better or worse, would in a lot of ways come to embody the 80s Steelers as sort of, well, we went from Terry Bradshaw to Mark Malone. What did you expect would happen?
And Malone is somebody who they drafted as a rookie in 1980. So he perfectly comes in at exactly the wrong time. He gets drafted right as the championships are ending. And that's tough, especially for a quarterback.
Yeah. So at the end of the 81 season, this is where you start to see some really significant retirements. Joe Green retires. L.C. Greenwood retires. And this is now 2 years in a row they haven't made the playoffs. This year they finished without a winning record for the first time in about 10 years. But the AFC is still, and this is as we're going to talk about the next few years, they're kind of able to fool people for another few years into not realizing how over it is yet. Because you think about it, the Raiders are still really good. It's not the John Madden Raiders anymore, but the Raiders are good. The AFC East, especially before Marino gets there, is not, no true powerhouse. You're in the middle of the shift from the best teams in the league or in the AFC to the best teams in the league or in the NFC. 81, San Francisco wins their first Super Bowl. The Bears very soon start to build up rapidly. The Redskins have the pieces in place where they would win the Super Bowl the next year. The Eagles have been, it's starting to shift to the other conference. So there's a few years we're going to talk about here where 9-7 wins 2 out of the 3 divisions in the AFC.
Well, it's shifting. And if you think about it, it's really shifting dramatically because 83, the Raiders beat the Redskins in the Super Bowl. And then the AFC doesn't win a Super Bowl again until 1997. So almost 15 years, 14 years there. So that shift is really, that's pronounced starting in about 82, 83.
Yep. 82 is a strike year, so it's hard to draw too much inference to any of this, but these are the last years for Lynn Swann and Jack Ham. So 2 more really crucial pieces of the Raiders dynasty are gone at the end of the 82 season. They finished 6-3, which gets them into the playoffs. It's also a year that's famous for the Steelers switched to a 3-4 defense, which has essentially been what they've run since 1982. So it's a big shift from what they ran. The steel curtain defense, the front 4 that was considered probably the best front 4 unit in football, certainly in the Super Bowl era. And now they're switching their defense, and probably a lot of it has to do with the fact that Joe Green is retired. But now they're running a 3-4. There's a point in the early 2000s where they're the only team in the league that runs a 3-4, and now it's come a little more back into style. But through the ebbs and flows of defensive football, since this time, the Steelers have been a 3-4 team predominantly.
And a team always known for really good linebackers.
Yep. So again, 82 is tough to fully grasp because they only play 9 games. The game they play September 13th, September 19th, then no games until right before Thanksgiving on November 21st. I know we just recently did the episode on the 82, all of 1982 in sports, and that included the 82 strike. So we won't get too much into like the reasons for any of those here, but they were 2-0 when the strike came, and they managed to stay above 500 the whole year and get in to the Super Bowl tournament, I guess it was called, in 1982, as the number 4 seed out of 8 that year, which meant they not only were in the playoffs, they actually hosted a playoff game in 1982.
Which they lose very close to the San Diego Chargers.
They lose 31-28 at Three River Stadium on January 29th, January 9th of 1983. So the end of the 82 season. Again, hard to put too much context on this one either way, except for the fact that Lynn Swann and Jack Ham are gone at the end of the year. They make the playoffs. They, finish above 500. But the most significant thing, probably of the first part of this, is what happens between the 1982 season and the start of the 1983 season.
But real quick, let me just note that they're up 28-17 in this second round AFC playoff game, and they lose it on a late comeback by San Diego. Hall of Famer Dan Fouts throws 2 late touchdown passes to his Hall of Fame tight end Kellen Winslow. The winner of that game goes on to play the Miami Dolphins in the AFC Championship game. And that's the AFC Championship. That's the Dolphins team with David Woodley at quarterback. He had gone back and forth between him and Don Strock. And Woodley was the starting quarterback. And that team gets they just get beaten to death in the Super Bowl against the Redskins. So had they managed to pull that game out, they very easily could have beaten Miami the following week and gone to another Super Bowl. So even though short season, 5-4, losing the second round, they're a little closer to potentially being in another Super Bowl than you might think.
Yeah. And, that's, you could also look at it the other way and say, hey, that team 5 years earlier, are they blowing a road playoff game or a home playoff game to San Diego at Three River Stadium?
Up 10 in the fourth quarter. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. So there's a lot to digest about what we're going to talk about next, which is the off season of 1983. Not that anybody's hanging on wondering where I'm going with this, but the top line of this is the Steelers, who, again, had made the playoffs, are picking 21st in the draft. And they pass up the quarterback from Pitt, a Pittsburgh kid named Dan Marino. Dan Marino goes 6 picks later to the Dolphins, who had just been in the Super Bowl the year before with David Woodley at quarterback, who's going to come back into our story in a little while. Marino, obviously, a year later, throws for 48 touchdowns, goes on to a Super Bowl appearance, a Hall of Fame career. The Steelers spend pretty much Marino's entire career. The Steelers, through decent teams, good teams, and bad teams, at no point have a quarterback anywhere near on the level of Dan Marino from 1983 on.
No, never.
Now, the reason I wanted that's worth digging into this is, and I have a good article the nice thing about this is there are a lot of good Steeler fan blogs. So it got to the point where in the late 80s, when we're looking at ones for late 80s, I was Googling specific games and coming up. The best one was a blog called Steel Curtain Rising. Basically any game I went to search for, the guy had written an article about, or somebody on the site had written an article. This is from Steel City Insider, but I think there's a lot of confusion, and we'll get to who the Steelers actually did draft in a couple of minutes, because that's an interesting story that I really wasn't aware of in the first place in its own right. There is a lot of the Steelers didn't draft Dan Marino because Dan Marino had character concerns, some of which I guess were true. There might have been some issues with him at Pitt, if I'm remembering correctly, or the Steelers didn't draft Dan Marino because they really liked what they had in Mark Malone. None of that is true. The real reason the Steelers didn't draft Dan Marino is because they were under the mistaken belief that Bradshaw still had a lot more good football in him. So they lose in early January of 83. The Steelers do. They lose that playoff game we were just talking about to the Chargers. And I'm reading a piece from a Steeler.com article by a guy named Bob Labriola from a few years, at least 10 years ago, but it wasn't a contemporary article. But he says the reason the Steelers didn't pick Marino had little to do with Marino and more to do with what they believed in Bradshaw, or at least what they thought they had in Bradshaw before March 3rd. On March 23rd of 1983, a Shreveport, a UPI store, United Press International, ran a story from Shreveport, Louisiana that said Terry Bradshaw had undergone surgery on his throwing arm under an alias. Do you know what the alias was? This is an interesting little coincidence.
It's funny. I do know this, and I just saw this like a week or two ago. Totally unrelated.
Thomas Brady.
Yeah, totally unrelated to preparing for this episode. They gave him the name Thomas Brady. Apparently, it wasn't actually him that came up with this. It was something the hospital just kind of, because if you think about it, Thomas Brady is a pretty generic name, so that they just kind of threw it up there. The hospital did this, not Bradshaw, but it is kind of one of those interesting sort of quirks of history that there's 3 quarterbacks who have won 4 Super Bowls or more, and one of them went in under the name of another one who would win 4 Super Bowls.
So Bradshaw's 35 years old. He has surgery sort of on his own in Shreveport by an orthopedist. It says if Bradshaw wanted to have the surgery, if he believed the surgery was necessary, that's okay. But getting it done in Shreveport under an assumed name instead of having the best elbow man in America do it makes no sense. And did his choice of surgeon accelerate the arrival of the end of Bradshaw's career? So Bradshaw, he's in his he's in his mid-30s, but he's 35. You would think he's still got a couple of years left. He has this surgery. The Steelers, whether they liked what they had in Mark Malone or Cliff Stout or whatever, they didn't draft Dan Marino because they thought they probably had 2 to 3 years left of Terry Bradshaw at the top of his game, when the reality of it is that they had less than 1 full game left in Terry Bradshaw's career.
And it's funny because in a lot of ways that thinking has changed in the NFL. And I'm thinking specifically of the Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers thing, but there are other examples too. The 49ers did it with Young and Joe Montana, even though Steve Young was a trade, not a draft. But nowadays, if you are pretty sure your quarterback's got at most 2 or 3 years left, you're getting somebody who can be there when he goes out. So a little bit of a different mindset now than there was in the early 80s.
It would almost be better if they thought they had something in Mark Malone. I wasn't saying that by way of absolving the Steelers, because if you think about it, they didn't pick a quarterback because they had a 35-year-old quarterback who just had elbow surgery. Even if they thought he was going to be back at 100%, you need to draft a quarterback in that situation. And you needed to draft a quarterback in 1983, too. So
I want to go on a little bit of a digression here because I found a lot of information on this, and I didn't know the appropriate place to bring it up, but this seems like a good place. I knew a little bit about this, but the relationship between Bradshaw and Noll and the relationship between Bradshaw and the city of Pittsburgh has never been a good one. I've seen Bradshaw interviewed and talked about Chuck Noll, and he's always talked about how he didn't really like him. He was hard on him, but, he understood that it was what made him successful. But Bradshaw has never said a lot of warm things about Chuck Noll. It also was sort of, in some of the research that I did, Bradshaw, even to this day, is very reluctant to go back to the city of Pittsburgh, and whether it's face the fans or just be there, there's a lot of sort of, I don't know if bad blood is the right word, but there's a lot of sensitivity on Bradshaw's part, and that drove home something that you and I actually talked about in person together at Christmas when we were watching the Franco Harris number retirement. And that was sort of a very odd and surreal situation because Harris had just passed away about 2 days before they were supposed to retire his number. And I don't know if you remember, but Bradshaw gave a little bit of an introduction, a televised introduction to the broadcast, but was not a part of the ceremony in Pittsburgh. And there were a number of reasons why I thought that could have been. It was Christmas time. It was cold. Some people, they, especially older people, they still have, COVID illness type concerns about being in large groups. Plus, Bradshaw is still doing TV, and it was a football weekend, obviously. And so, look, it's possible that any number of those were the real reasons why Bradshaw wasn't there in person. But as I was reading in this Pomerantz book and a couple other places, one of the things that immediately struck me about Bradshaw and the city of Pittsburgh is that maybe some of his lack of attendance, even as recently as 3 months ago, is related to some of these lingering bad feelings he has towards the way he perceived that he was treated. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's he's always had cover the last 30 or so years that he does the Fox pregame show. So, why would he have time to, he wouldn't have, he's got, on any given time, he's got an excuse for why he can't be there, because he's got to be in LA doing the Fox pregame show. But I did remember hearing a lot about that he was sort of not necessarily estranged from the organization, but maybe half a degree above that for a guy in his position.
Bradshaw didn't go to Noll's funeral, whenever that was, within the last 10 years or so. So you're right. He has had an excuse, but he also has not engaged very much, which is interesting for a guy who's still out there so much in the football world. This isn't a guy who's lived as a recluse. He's still remained very much.
No, it'd be nice if he was a little more reclusive, to be honest. But,
you don't want to win his money?
No, he's everywhere. But, so a couple of things with Noll, because I think it's a decent time to talk about him beyond just the biographical information. He's a tough guy to pin down because he wasn't a disciplinarian in the sense of off the field. He really didn't, they always contrast him with the first Super Bowl they were in against the Vikings, where Bud Grant basically wouldn't let his players leave the hotel except to go to practice. And Chuck Noll basically got down there and told them all, get the partying out of your system now early in the week, so we can get down to business later in the week. He wasn't New Orleans. He wasn't a, taskmaster in that regard. What he was very, very detail oriented. And they would say he would go over with guys things like their 3-point stance and go over it and say, no, your right leg is not far back enough. You're not going to generate the power we need you to. Or he would, work with a linebacker and say, no, you're opening your hips the wrong way. And, and basically he was a guy who was when he played for the Browns, he was also a substitute teacher because the money was so bad. He was a fringe roster guy. He would also be he was also a substitute teacher. He went, I believe he studied to be a lawyer for a while and decided he couldn't do it just because of the confrontational nature of it. But so it wasn't a yeller, screamer, or grab your face mask, trim your sideburns guy. But I could see where, especially, if you're a guy like Terry Bradshaw and it's 1977 and you've won a couple of Super Bowls and he's getting on you about your, which way you're opening your shoulders to make your second read. And I don't know that this is what it was, but you could see that where it could just be eventually that level of sort of, there may have been personalities involved, but it's not hard to imagine why a star player eventually, especially Noll being predominantly a defensive coach, why Bradshaw might have thought he was beyond that. And I also think Bradshaw held bitterness just from when he first came up in the whole thing with, was it Gilliam?
Yeah, Junior Gilliam, who was one of the first black starting quarterbacks in the NFL and who he kind of went back and forth with at the beginning as the starter. There might have actually even been a third guy involved in that whole thing. Bradshaw later said in an interview, by the way, probably in several interviews, Noll never knew how to handle me. So, yeah, Bradshaw always kind of bitter is, I think, the right word. I would point out, though, just looking at his stats, he actually led the league in touchdown passes in 1982. Now, it was a 9-game season, so it was a little different, but it's not as if there was no basis to think that he might have a little more in the tank going into 83 and beyond.
And just before we jump into 83, since we're talking about Noll, there's a really good article here from The Athletic. It's called The Steelers' Lost Decade, The Lessons of the 1980s Could Help in the Future. And this is from 3 years ago, I guess, as they were pondering a Roethlisberger-less future for the Steelers. And they talk about Noll, and they say that one of the issues he had is that early in the 70s, he was very good at identifying assistant coaches and guys that could help in that regard. And then, as happens today, you lose those guys and you have to replace them. And I guess failing in that regard, and then also simply just being too loyal to some of these veteran guys. And, you get that where it's like, well, this guy was really, really good for me in 1978 and he's still playing. So why wouldn't I go with him? And it's like, well, because he's 37 now instead of 31. So again, that's not a real revelation, but that's sort of one of the two big things they chalk it up to when assigning any blame to Noll, was that he was unable to find good replacements, lots of turnover on the staff after the 70s, and then, just simply being too loyal. And we're going to talk about, when we get to the late 80s, a major shakeup that was imposed on him. But, those were sort of the two big knocks for him, because he was the coach the whole time of this. That's one thing that's going to be unique to him compared to a lot of these wilderness years we're going to do eventually. The guy who was the coach in the dynasty is the coach the whole time. I guess you could say Landry with the late 80s Cowboys too.
And I should note that I used that Athletic article as well. It's called The Steelers' Lost Decade. Like you said, it was written by a gentleman by the name of Ed Bouchette. We should give him some credit, and we will put the in the show notes. So yeah, I think that article and what you said is all dead on sort of the Noll, Bradshaw, Steelers veterans in general dynamic in the early 80s.
So getting back into sort of our chronology with 1983, because there's some interesting stuff to talk about. But since we're on the Bradshaw thing, I figured I'd just mention this. So, and there's a great YouTube clip I wish we could play, but the YouTube has the whole clip of this. But Bradshaw doesn't play until the second to last game of the season at Shea Stadium against the Jets. He comes on, he plays two drives. They're both touchdown drives. He throws a 10-yard pass to Calvin Sweeney for a touchdown, and he goes over to the sideline and tells, I guess, I don't know if it was Noll or a trainer, tells him, I heard something pop in my elbow as I threw the ball, and basically I'm done. And that was the end of his career. The YouTube clip is great because they show him throw the touchdown, and the video, the CBS broadcast has him go over, and you see him explaining. And the broadcaster says something along the lines of like, looks like he's saying he felt something in his elbow. And then just on top of that, for my own enjoyment, because of being a, New York sports fan, they're like, and then the Jets playing their last game here at Shea Stadium. They'll be moving to Giants Stadium next year. And then they show a picture of the Polo Grounds, and they're like, speaking of great former New York sports venues, can you identify this? We'll tell you after the break. I was like, so this was not only was it what I was looking for the moment, it was like the perfect clip for me. So I just figured I would mention that.
Yeah, and that is interesting that Bradshaw's career ends on the day that the Jets end pretty much football at Shea Stadium. Probably, I don't know, maybe there was some sort of weird college game or something at some point, but that's one of the last football games at Shea Stadium. So a lot of things coming to an end on that gray December day in Queens in late 83.
So as for the actual season, they go 10-6. Cliff Stout is the quarterback for the other 15 games. It says here the Steelers actually, all the Steelers fans, and this is probably a pretty good sign of why what happened in the offseason with them happened, not with the Steelers, but with their opponent. Steelers fans filled Memorial Stadium in Baltimore for the Steelers-Colts game, and it was the Colts' first sellout in 6 years since 1977. So in that offseason, the Colts would be beating a path to Indianapolis, probably because they were only selling games out once every 6 years with opposing fans.
Yeah, I was going to say another team that's on its way out of something in 1983.
Yeah. So, 83, and I'm look. So they go 10-6, and I have a note here that basically the weak division is prolonging this a little bit. The Browns had a nice year in 80. Obviously, the Bengals went to the Super Bowl in 81, but they're only in a 4-team division. The Oilers fell like a rock in the early 80s. In 83, they were 2-14. There's a lot of years here, like in 84, which we'll talk about. They win the division at 9-7. So the fact that in 1983 in the AFC, there was only 3 teams that finished with 10 or more wins, and everybody else was 9-7 or worse. So the Steelers are able to get not only into the playoffs, but win a division just by virtue of how, weak the other 3 teams in the division are. Sort of looking at familiar names, Franco Harris still rushes for 1,000 yards at 33 years old. He starts in all 16 games. Bradshaw obviously plays in 2 drives. John Stallworth at 31 years old is still there. On the defensive side of the ball, Jack Lambert is still there. Donnie Shell is still there. Mel Blount is still there. But, most of the rest of the team, it's turned over. But there's still a few holdouts in 83.
Yeah, and you're going to talk about 84 in a minute. 84, they're actually surprisingly good.
Yeah, and they had a better record in 83. So 83, they get to the playoffs. They're, like I said, they're the 3 seed, but they are beaten 10-7 by the Raiders in the divisional round in LA. I think it was a weird thing at the time where the way the seedings worked, they ended up having to play, even though they won the division, they ended up having to play the number 1 seed in that round. So they were the Raiders a wild card in 1983? No, that was 80.
I'm not sure about that. I'll look that up real quick. They might have been.
No, the Raiders went 12-4. So whatever. But the other 3 playoff teams were all from the AFC West. So this wild card ended up playing in Miami. So the Steelers went to LA and lost. So 10-7, obviously not a blowout, but they're in the divisional round. They lose their first playoff game. And then we set the stage for 84, which is definitely the most significant one of these years that occurs. And it's really the last hurrah. You can't even really say it's the last hurrah of the Steel Curtain team, because if you look, John Stallworth, Mike Webster, Donnie Shell, couple of guys who started who began their career in 1977, Gary Dunn, Robin Cole, Larry Brown, but really Donnie Shell, Mike Webster, John Stallworth. Franco Harris was gone by 84 to the Seahawks. So really it's an entirely different team by 1984.
And the Harris thing, that's a bitter exit in and of itself. Chuck Noll at one point tries to get an assistant coach to talk Franco Harris into retiring. The assistant says, no, I'm not going to do this for a guy like that. Either you or the ownership or the Rooneys have to talk to Harris. Harris, I guess, kind of doesn't get the hint. He doesn't want to retire, and then he ends up getting traded to Seattle to have sort of one last not so great season before he finally does decide to retire. But that's a guy they were hoping to kind of ease out the door a little bit politely, and it just doesn't work out that way. So some of these guys are leaving, but not doing so maybe in the most the easiest way. They're not, Harris especially, he's not sort of politely retiring. He kind of, won't take the hint. They end up feeling like their hands are tied. They have to trade him. Stallworth, on the other hand, has a really good year in 84, wins comeback player of the year. So at least 1 or 2 of the old guys are still contributing.
And they also have a big newcomer that year in Lewis Lips, who
Another receiver.
I remember from Tecmo Super Bowl, which came out in 1991, and he's one of the bigger players on the Steelers in that game. So he's sort of, it's not a wasteland. There's some guys that they bring onto the team in the 80s that have good careers, or at least several good years, just not on very good teams because of the era that they played in. One thing I wanted to mention to close the loop, which we're going a little bit backwards, but in 83, I talked about so they passed on Marino. The guy they did draft was a defensive lineman named Gabriel Rivera. And just sort of what made this even worse was that Gabriel Rivera in 1983, he had 2 sacks in his first 6 games. And then on October 20th of 83, he was paralyzed in a car wreck while he was driving drunk. He crossed into another lane, collided with another vehicle. It says the 22-year-old was treated for head, neck, chest, and abdominal injuries, as well as significant memory loss. Never obviously played football again. I don't think he had a very high quality of life after that. He did hang on and survive until 2018, but, obviously on top of them passing on Dan Marino, they drafted a guy who only played 6 games in his career and in himself in a car wreck while he was driving drunk.
And it's funny because those type of things seem to happen to teams when things are kind of going downhill otherwise. The one that immediately comes to mind is Len Bias with the Celtics, but I think there are other examples that you can think of too. That tends to be a sign of a team that's either on the decline or just things aren't going so well for them in general.
And sometimes it's as benign as a guy who has a couple of good years, who's like they're banking on to be the future of the franchise, and in his second year he blows his knee out and is never the same player. It's not always tragedy, but so 84, and we'll talk about.
Can I just, before you get to 84, I just want to loop back to the Harris thing real quick. And this is from the Pomerantz book that I referenced. As part of the bitterness of the fallout between the Steelers and Harris, somebody asks Noll a question about Harris, and Noll says, Franco who? And apparently that sticks with Franco Harris for 30 years. So as well it should for a guy who made the biggest play in team history and then immaculate receptions, won 4 Super Bowls and a Super Bowl MVP. I think maybe that speaks to some of the stuff you were saying about Chuck Noll's personality before. So in addition to Bradshaw being bitter, Harris is bitter for a long time too.
So the 84 team, just to set the stage. So the guy who'd been the quarterback for most of 83 and really been predominantly Bradshaw's backup before that was a guy named Cliff Stout. He leaves to go to the USFL. So Bradshaw's gone. Cliff Stout is gone. Mark Malone starts 9 games, and David Woodley, the quarterback of previously had been the Dolphins quarterback in the 1982 Super Bowl. Obviously, then they drafted Marino. Marino is now on his way to going to the Super Bowl and throwing 48 touchdowns. David Woodley comes in, and he starts 7 games for the Steelers. Now, he goes 1-6 in those 7 games. So, obviously, Malone is the one who does the majority of the successful performing in this season. But I just figured I would mention sort of the shift at quarterback there. Before we even get to the playoffs, the 1984 Steelers are very famous, or not very famous, but their claim to fame on this season is that they defeated the 49ers, and they are the only team that beat the 49ers that year. The 49ers went 15-1 and won the Super Bowl, and the Steelers beat them mid-October. So the 49ers were undefeated. The Steelers go to California to play the 49ers. They were at 500 going in. Malone was the quarterback by this point, and they end up beating the 49ers in a game that the 49ers have a 17-10 lead. The Steelers have a 15-play, 83-yard drive that ends on a Frank Pollard is the leading offensive player on the field for the Steelers that day. They end up with a first and goal at the 6. Mark Malone hits John Stallworth, still there, still making big plays. They tie the game. Montana gets the ball back with 3 minutes to go. They hit a field goal to make it, the 49ers can't do anything. Steelers get the ball back. Gary Anderson hits a field goal to give them a 3-point lead and ultimately end up winning the game 20-17 for the big upset on the road, and the 49ers go down to 6-1.
And I would note that Stallworth is having maybe his best career as a pro, even though he only played in 4 games the year before. And he played in 9 the year after that, but he'd missed a significant chunk of time in both 80 and 83. But in 84, at 32 years of age, 80 receptions, 1,395 yards, and 11 touchdowns. All of those are career highs for the Hall of Famer John Stallworth. So while pretty much everybody else from that team is, with the exception of Mike Webster, who basically sticks around throughout the 80s, but all those other guys, offense and defense, are either gone or significantly diminished in their role, Stallworth is still playing some of the best football of his career in 1984 at 32 years of age.
And in that game, Montana, 24 of 34 for 241 yards, but he doesn't throw a touchdown. He's intercepted once, and, it's the 84 49ers, and the Steelers managed to hold him to 17 points. And like I said, they're the only team to figure the next year, the 85 Bears in that game against the Dolphins gets tons and tons of coverage because of, it being the 85 Bears, and then the Dolphins with the whole undefeated thing. This was a similar thing the year before, and this game was on the road. They went out and beat and maybe because it was a little earlier in the season too, the 49ers are only 6-0 instead of 11 or 12-0. But, the only loss of the season for the 49ers was to the Steelers team.
And it's not as poetic because it's not the Dolphins and all that stuff too. But yeah, your point is a good one.
Yep. So the Steelers they win the division. They end up going to Denver in the divisional round of the 1984 playoffs against the John Elway. It's Elway's second year in the league because he was drafted in that same draft in 83. And the Steelers managed to take a 10-7 lead into the half. Broncos go up 17-10. And then the Steelers get a touchdown from Mark Malone to Lewis Lips late in the third to tie it. And then Frank Pollard with a 2-yard rush in the closing minutes of the game. And the Steelers get the last playoff win of the Chuck Noll era, sort of the last hurrah.
Is that the last win? I think it is, right? Or I know in 89 they make the playoffs, but did they win a game in 89?
Oh, you know what? They might win a game in 89. I could be. Yeah, I think I might be wrong about that. So, yep, you're right.
They beat Houston in 89 in another close game.
All right, well, we'll get to that. I'm sorry. So it's sort of the so they get this win on the road in Denver, and suddenly this Steelers team is back in the AFC Championship game. Terry Bradshaw's gone. Joe Green is gone. All these guys are gone. They're one win away from the Super Bowl, and not for nothing, they're the only team in the league that's beaten the 49ers.
It's a good point.
And they had a chance to play them again in the Super Bowl. Now, I don't think that would have gone the same way, but they end up going to Miami in the AFC Championship game. Dan Marino, who, like we said, was never close in the second half. They lose 45-28. Marino goes 21 of 34 for 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, 421 yards. Malone plays, decently on the other side with 20 of 36 for, I believe, 320 something yards. But obviously Marino in that year wins that game and goes to his first, and it turns out, only Super Bowl ever. So Steelers with a valiant season, sort of what seems to be a revitalization. They win a playoff game, and they go down and lose to the Dolphins in the eventual MVP of the league in the AFC Championship game.
There's an interesting anecdote that I read somewhere from that game, and I don't remember exactly where I read it, but on one play, Lambert sort of levels Dan Marino on a blitz, and Marino was still able to complete the pass, I think, to a running back. And the players on the sideline say, well, basically, if Marino is going to be able to complete a pass, even after getting hit that way by Jack Lambert, we know we don't have a chance in this game. And it's sort of an interesting changing of the guard moment where sort of one of the anchors of the 80s Steel Curtain defense hits this young superstar in Dan Marino, but isn't able to stop him. So the Dolphins, it's a changing of the guard.
They were basically like, if we can't get him on that play, how are we going to get him?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is sort of another inflection point because there's a steep drop off after this. They've made the playoffs 3 years in a row now. They've actually, they got to the AFC Championship game in 1984. They beat the team that eventually won the Super Bowl. Not that that's the be all and end all, but team goes 18-1. You're the team who beat them. That means something. That's sort of the end of it for a while. In 1985, they go 7-9. They end up losing 5 of their last 6 games. They actually, like I mentioned before, they only finish, I believe, a game out of first place. So they actually were somewhat in it until the end of the season because Cleveland wins the division at 8-8, and them and Cincinnati are both 7-9. So, had they only lost 4 of their last 6, or certainly 3 of their last 6, they may have actually been a playoff team that year. They might have won the division at 8-8. Mm-hmm. Malone starts 8 games. David Woodley starts 6, and someone named Scott Campbell starts 2 games in 1985 for them. So again, maybe only 2 games worse than they were the year before, but still only 7-9 out of the playoffs, losing record, and losing 5 of their last 6 games, and they were blown out in a few of these games. If you look at their down the stretch, they lost a game. They let up 54 points to San Diego. They lost 28-10 to the Giants the last week of the year. And, by now, this is sort of the official start of, outside of John Stallworth, there's really nobody left from those glory day teams at this point.
Webster's still there.
Oh, Webster is still there. You're right.
I think Webster lasts all the way to like 1990 and even goes to play in Kansas City for a year or 2.
I probably have that written in here. So 86 is almost the exact same situation, except in reverse. So in 86, they go 6-10. So they're a game worse than they were the year before that. But in 86, they started 1-6. And then after that finished 5-4. So that's not, finishing 5-4 is not like some insane run, but when you start 1-6, it's a much bigger deal. The thing I noticed is this is the first time they finished in the bottom half in both offense and defense. So they finished 18th in offense, 17th in defense. So, they're not bottom 3 or 4, but they're now a bottom half of the league team in both units. So it's not like, we still are holding on to some really good defensive personnel, but the offense is, holding us back or vice versa. They're mediocre on both sides of the ball by this point.
Yeah. And that's when they go from being a team that you have to worry about to one that's just middle of the road to worse than that.
So Mark Malone starts 14 of the games. Bubby Brister gets 2 starts, his first sort of pop up on this narrative here. It's funny because they went 5-4 down the stretch, and 2 of their losses were in back-to-back games in overtime to Cleveland and Chicago, both teams who went to conference championship games that year. They were both top 2 seeds. Chicago lost in the second round. But they lost both of those games in overtime on the road to good teams. They also lost to Buffalo by just 4 points, and they lost to Kansas City by just 5 points. So they were pretty close in almost every game they played down the stretch, but this is still a mediocre team that, really is they're the Tampa Bay Bucks. Well, they're better than the Bucks, but they're just they're the Lions. They're a run of the mill bad team by this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's going to be the last couple of years, not much interesting to say. Some interesting stuff starts to happen in 1987. First of all, Mike Webster's still there. They go 8-7. It's another strike year. They miss the playoffs barely, but this is also the year they draft Rod Woodson, Hardy Nickerson, and Greg Lloyd. So 3 guys who would be big parts of those 90s teams that finally start to get good.
And you said Webster's still there, but so is Stallworth.
Stallworth is still there.
So is Donnie Shell, who I think Johnny Shell's another defensive back who I think he just get on the Hall of Fame in the last couple of years, Donnie Shell, but he's a Hall of Fame defensive back. You don't think about Rod Woodson, who ended up playing with Ray Lewis on the Ravens championship team 12, 13 years later, and Donnie Shell, who's, a steel curtain guy. You don't think of those guys sharing the same defensive backfield, but 1987, they did. And that's another sort of those interesting kind of, if you want to call it a passing of the torch moment or just kind of an interesting coincidence. But that was interesting to me also.
The most interesting thing about 87 to me, though, is, and by the way, Mike Malone mostly is the starting quarterback of this year. Mark Malone. You know who else is on this team in 1987?
I do not.
Steve Bono.
Oh, I did see that. Yeah, who ends up being Joe Montana and Steve Young's backup in San Francisco, and then
Montana's backup in
Kansas City. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think he played a few games when Young was hurt, but Montana was still on the team. It was great, but just an interesting name there. The most interesting, so you got to remember though, by now it's 1987. It's Chuck Noll is still the guy. It's been almost 10 years since they won a Super Bowl at this point. They've been mediocre. Now they've been bad. The league there's different characters coming into the league. Obviously, guys like Parcells are sort of the personalities from a coaching standpoint. Parcells, Ditka, Joe Gibbs was not that kind of guy, but he's certainly one of the more prolific coaches. Then you have Marty Schottenheimer, but then you have a coach in Houston, Jerry Glanville, who I knew Jerry Glanville as the CBS C team announcer. He kind of always sounded like a yokel to me on TV. I guess I remember him when he was like the Falcons coach or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1987, he's coaching what's considered to be an Oilers team that's back on the resurgence. And they had gotten a lot of publicity for being borderline dirty or not even borderline dirty. And Jerry Glanville was in his second season as the coach. He had sort of embraced a role as like, well, we're going to be the Black Hats and criticizing the NFL and, not caring if he got fined, that kind of thing. And he had, before the Steelers game against the Oilers late in the season in Houston, Glanville referred to the Astrodome as the House of Pain and made references that Steeler players might not make it out alive. And given his reputation for encouraging not just hard hits, but for his players to take cheap shots and attempt to injure players, which I think he only did the barest minimum to try and deny that. Noll said during the game, he had told an Oiler player to tell Noll to meet him, or to tell Glanville to meet him after the game because there were going to be problems. And then after the game in the handshake, Noll said, and this is picked up by microphone, but it's got the old like 70s, 80s bleep where it's like where you can't hear half. You know what I'm talking about? Where you
I know
can't
exactly
hear, like,
what you're talking about.
Half of what they're saying because of how much they're bleeping it out. He basically tells them like, watch your mouth with that kind of like won't get out alive stuff. Like that'll come back to bite your ass in this league. And I'm trying to pull up the exact quote, but that basically he grabbed him and told him, knock it off with that. Cause that'll give you some comeback. He said, that'll come back to haunt you. I'm serious. So Noll, who at this point has been a coach for darn near 20 years, a head coach,
won 4 Super Bowls,
has to know he's in the twilight of his team. And But, here's a guy coming in and is not, to his mind, respecting the game and playing it the right way. And he makes his point known. And he had to know there was going to be cameras there and that it was going to be picked up and that there was going to be coverage of it. But he wanted to make his point known. And he got in Jerry Glanville's face about it.
And Glanville was a clown.
Yeah, I mean, he was a guy who was very clearly there to make headlines, and so
he was
there's
almost like a
quote.
Rex Ryan type with the exact opposite body type.
So Noll had told a guy on the Steelers, or a guy in the Oilers, he said, number 24, tell your coach I'm going to meet him after the game and kick his butt. Noll said to Steelers cornerback Steve Brown, who do you think is going to win? My money is on you, Coach, Brown said. And then what Noll said to Glanville was, listen, your guy's coming over here jumping people. It's going to get you in serious trouble. I'm serious. So there'd been a fight during the game, but, obviously you don't think of a guy like Chuck Noll interacting. And I'll be honest, I had never heard that story. I don't know how familiar you were with that story. I didn't know any of that.
I had never heard that story either.
And that's what I mean. And that's kind of the stuff you unearth with this digging into these like overlooked periods. When I looked at that, I was like, see, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. I felt validated about doing an episode on this.
Yeah, he sort of played that kind of elder statesman role. Sort of, it's funny because you think about in football, at least, and it probably applies in other sports too, but you think about in football, at least, like, Lombardi coached those Packer teams. And then he was gone, and he, passed away after a year in Washington. Bill Walsh left the 49ers in 1988, never coached again in the NFL. He went back to college a little bit and coached a little bit in college. Meanwhile, you have the two biggest coaches of the 70s, the two big 70s powerhouses, one dynasty and one sort of quasi-dynasty, Chuck Noll with Pittsburgh and Tom Landry with the Cowboys, and both coach all throughout the 80s in this sort of elder statesman, not really winning, but still sort of a part of the league role. So that's an interesting, for both of them, kind of hanging around in a way that other dynasty coaches don't really do in any sport, really.
So in 1988,
can I just break in here real quick?
Go ahead.
You're talking about Steve Bono, and I just think this is interesting because as you were talking there, I just looked at his stats a little more. You talk about a guy with an interesting career. He starts in Minnesota, then he's got a couple years in Pittsburgh, like you said, with Noll, and still with some of these guys like John Stallworth, who are still in the league after all those years. Then he goes to San Francisco for 5 years, and it's part of the tail end of those Montana young quarterback controversy years. Wins a Super Bowl with them in 89. Then he goes to Kansas City, backs up Montana for a couple of years. Then when Montana retires, he starts with Kansas City again in 95. He's the starter, starts all 16 games, makes the Pro Bowl, goes 13-3. 96, he's still with Kansas City. 97, he's in Green Bay as Brett Favre's backup on a team that makes it to the Super Bowl in 97, loses to Denver. And then in 98, he's in St. Louis with the Rams, Dick Vermeil's first year, and he's the backup to Tony Banks with the Rams, and Kurt Warner is the third stringer. So think about all of these great all-time NFL teams that he's a part of for just a year or two.
Yeah, the different coaches and quarterbacks and things he's been involved in.
Yeah, Favre, Montana, Young, Warner, Vermeil, Noll, Walsh, Seifert. It's really Holmgren. It's crazy.
Who was the Steelers? Who was those Chiefs coach? Was that Schottenheimer?
Schottenheimer, another one. Yeah, exactly.
88, they fall even further. They go 5-11. It's the worst record they've had since 1969 when they went 1-13. I think really telling, the defense is last in the league in points allowed. They allow 26.3 points per game. So they've fallen now in 10 years or 9 years from the steel curtain to the worst defense in the league from a points standpoint. What is significant is that in 1988, these are the first sustained, serious calls from people for Chuck Noll to be fired. He was obviously getting by for a while on reputation, and the team had been decent. This is now 3 years out of the playoffs. They've lost. They're 5-11 now. There's really nothing redeeming about the team. As late as 1988, they had lost to Cincinnati 42-7. Noll had intended to resign, and he told defensive line coach Joe Green, who informed Dan Rooney, who was also at the time considering firing Noll.
And in case anybody's wondering, this is the same Joe Green. This is Mean Joe Green.
Yes. This is that Joe Green. They meet and agree to basically Noll will remain on. He also gets a position as a consultant or some sort of advisor for the rest of his life, which was a position he held despite really never doing anything, certainly not in the last 20 years of his life. But what he agrees to is that basically Rooney wants him to eliminate several assistant coaches, and he wants Tony Dungy, who'd been the defensive coordinator, to be demoted back to secondary coach. Dungy, who's been the defensive coordinator for several years, decides, screw that. He leaves. He goes to Kansas City as the secondary coach instead. And do you know, as sort of the irony of all ironies in this, do you know who the defensive coordinator in Kansas City is at the time? So Dungy leaves as defensive coordinator. He's going to be demoted to secondary coach. So instead he goes to Kansas City as the secondary coach, working under their defensive coordinator.
Who?
Bill Cowher.
Oh, jeez.
Who we'll talk about in a little while. So this is sort of the first time there's a power struggle. It's weird because Rooney's thinking about firing Noll. Noll's thinking about resigning, and somehow they make an agreement where Noll remains the coach.
And 6 other guys lose their jobs.
Yeah. What that says to me is, and this is, we're very familiar in New York with Wellington Mara's sort of and this does in no way compares because it's half the amount of time. From 1963 to 1978, generously, the Maras, Wellington Mara specifically, would not adapt to the time, but was unwilling to pull the trigger on things. By 1988, Dan Rooney had to know he had seen all he was going to see from Chuck Noll, and that it probably was time for Chuck Noll to leave. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. You know what I mean? Like, he was thinking about firing him. He meets with him. He says, you have to fire most of your assistants, but you can stay. That shows to me an owner who is afraid to make the tough decision at that point. And I know he's been a great owner, the whole franchise ownership, but in that instance, that's kind of hard to justify at that point, isn't it?
It is, and it's also of a theme because Noll came to the Steelers in 1969, and we're now going into the 2023 season. And that's 54 years, I want to say, 54, 55 seasons, and they've had 3 coaches. Cowher sort of left on top. Did Cowher retire right after they won the Super Bowl in 2006? I don't remember.
So they won the Super Bowl at the end of the 2005 season.
Okay.
He coached them in 2006, and I think they went like 9-7. They were okay, but they didn't even make the playoffs. They might have actually even gone 10-6. I think they played their last game of the year, and it was whatever. He left. Tomlin came in 2007, and Tomlin won the Super Bowl in his second year. So,
and Tomlin is still there to this day, and it's a question of, if and when he'll leave. So, it's of a piece with what goes on with the Steelers with coaches, especially coaches that have won for them. And all their coaches have won for them.
89 is an interesting.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude. And I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.